Earlier this year, as many of you will recall, Metro Police here in Las Vegas received a late-night phone call from a terrified family who reported they had aliens in their backyard, 8 to 10 feet tall aliens. One of these aliens was supposedly trying to engage a front-loader machine in their yard. And that probably sounded a little crazy, but to the police, to their credit, they took it seriously. They came out to the scene, they looked around, they patrolled the backyard with a certain amount of trepidation in their voices. You could hear it on their body cam videos that we obtained and released. I mean, they were on guard in case the report was accurate. They returned days later to look around again. They installed a camera on the roof of this home. They didn't see any aliens, but they do not believe the family was hoaxing them. So how would or should police prepare for the day when they actually confront actual ETs or crash saucers or other related situations? Could first responders get some training? Should they? My next guest says yes. Richard Lang has written a first responder's guide to UFO encounters, and it is a doozy. He joins us in just a moment to talk UFOs. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Richard Lang is one of the most experienced and best, most credible UFO investigators in the world. He's the agency director for AREA, Aerospace Research Investigation Reporting Agency. He's been a UAP researcher and investigator since the early 90s. He served as the STAR team manager. That was part of the DIA's OSAP UFO investigation, the largest UFO investigation ever funded by our government. He was with it from the beginning of the project until it ended, and it was at the time the most advanced non-government rapid response UAP investigative team in the world. He's here to talk about his new book, UFO Investigations, First Responders Guide to UFO Encounters. Richard, welcome back.
Hey, good morning, George. Thanks for having me.
As you know, I mean, so much has happened since you were here the last time. I'd like to talk to you about some current events as a sort of a transition, a segue into your new book. You saw the hearing before Congress back in July. There's David Grush, whistleblower, spilling some beans, Dave Fravor, Ryan Graves. Astonishing testimony, solid questions from the members of Congress, lots of media coverage. Seems like we've come a long way in a short period of time on this subject. Would you agree?
I would. And I think a lot of that in part is because of the legislation with the National Defense Authorization Act, where they put language in there basically giving these individuals immunity for and releasing them from part of their national security agreements, where they could come and testify to Congress without being prosecuted. I really think that's opened up a lot of doors.
How credible do you say Dave Grush is? I mean, he's told an incredible tale, elaborate, greatly detailed, saying that he was given an assignment by the UAP task force to go look at special access programs and see if there is evidence of crash retrievals, reverse engineering, all the stuff that's existed in UFO folklore for a long time. He went there, interrogated witnesses, got them under oath, and says, yeah, he found it. What do you think?
Well, I think that everything he said is consistent with, what I've learned over the last 30 years. We've known for a long time that this stuff has been going on, and it's been very carefully guarded and covered up. And, what he said is true. I'm positive that what he said is he's right on.
It's an interesting time for whistleblowers. Dave Grush says he's got a couple of dozen other people that have given testimony behind closed doors to Congress, to the Inspector General. They're a little worried about what happens next, because we've seen what's been attempted to do with Grush. He gets slimed in a media story that gets leaked, and who knows what these other whistleblowers, if they have any kind of skeletons in their lives at all. I would think that it strikes them as being sent a message that they better be careful if they're going to come forward with information.
Well, I think that we're dealing with, it's classic American politics, is you've got people on both sides of this. Some of the defense contractors who have certain members of Congress under their control are, obviously doing everything they can to slow this down and keep it quiet because of their own involvement in it and what implication that might be for them. So, absolutely, that it doesn't surprise me that these people would be, messed with in various ways. But from what I'm hearing, there are a whole bunch of these people coming forward. dozens of people that will eventually be scheduled to testify. It'll be really hard to refute all of that.
We've heard these stories for me, it's been 36 years, but of chasing the stories about crash saucers, recovered saucers in secret hangars being reverse engineered by government contractors, maybe by government personnel as well. And it's always been a pretty fanciful tale that was hard to prove. Are we on the verge of actually proving this? Or do you think, as I suspect, that the keepers of the secrets have started a big pushback that they will fight tooth and nail before they give up this technology, which could be worth trillions if they can ever figure it out?
Well, I think, I've written about that. There's several chapters in my book about that. And essentially what we're dealing with is something that's been going on since the Truman administration. Back then, there were crashes, was wreckage recovered. And essentially what they did is they looked at that in terms of how it might give us a technological advantage from a military standpoint. And so they kept it secret, and they made deals with technology companies to do the research and the back engineering. And I think by the time Eisenhower was ready to leave office, one of the frustrations that he expressed was that these multinational corporations who if you look at some of these companies and what was given to them in the 60s, and all of a sudden these little, fairly ho-hum technology companies become multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations in a very short period of time because of the technology that they've developed. And they've made a ton of money, billions of dollars on it. And by the time Eisenhower was ready to leave office, they had kind of gone renegade on them and gone behind the back of Congress and the president, and they were basically doing their own thing in secrecy. When Eisenhower said, beware of the military-industrial complex, because of the misplaced power, that's what he was talking about.
In your book, in the new book, and we'll get into it in great detail, you have a section about the press. For me, that represents one of the biggest changes is how the news media in general has changed on this subject. It's a dramatic change.
Yes. And that's one of the things I said. I remember I went to a symposium, a MUFON symposium. It was in Washington, D.C. back in the 90s. And I remember we pulled up in the drive-through for the hotel. There was some guy jumping around with a big tinfoil hat on, and kind of had a little clown act going. And, of course, we went to the symposium, and by that time, there was literally dozens of people that were PhDs and researchers and very distinguished individuals that attended that meeting. Well, when we got back home, one of the Washington newspapers wrote an article about the symposium, and as you can imagine, guess whose picture was on the front page of the newspaper? It was the guy with the tinfoil hat.
Yeah.
But I really think that is so dramatically changing now. And even in my own life and my research, 10 years ago, people would treat you like a kook, or like, there's just fairy tales or conspiracy theory. But now I think particularly with the testimony, like with Gresh and the things that are coming out in Congress, mainstream media, 6 o'clock news people are talking about alien bodies or non-human bodies and alien, extraterrestrial spacecraft wreckage. So I think the public awareness has dramatically opened up, and it's made it a lot easier for everyone in this world to do the work.
It's been more than 5.5 years since that New York Times story came out, December 2017, that changed everything. Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, Helene Cooper do this front page story about ATIP, $22 million that Harry Reid had secured that went to ATIP, which wasn't exactly true. The $22 million went to OSAP, which is the program you worked on. And, because the New York Times covered it, other media found it, well, it must be okay then that we could look into it. So there was a wave of new coverage, and to some degree it's still going on. But it seems like the New York Times has backtracked. We've seen very little additional stories from them except for hostile anti-UFO stories. And Washington Post dragged its feet on the Dave Grush story. We know 60 Minutes did a piece, and then they haven't done another one. Do you feel that there might be some backpedaling by the big media folks?
I think there probably is some of that going on, but I think that once you open a can of worms like this, you're not going to get the lid back on it. When Gresh testified in Congress, I noticed that the one congresswoman asked him specifically where, who has this stuff and where is it? And basically, he said to them, I have a list of all the facilities that have recovered wreckage and bodies and what's in those facilities. And if you want, I'll go in the skiff with you and give it to you. And I understand that he did do that. So he essentially gave a half a dozen members of Congress lists of where all these facilities are and what's in these facilities. And I think once you go that far, it's going to be pretty hard to take it back. And I'm not so sure they wouldn't try, but I don't know if it's going to work for them.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of arm twisting on Congress, on Capitol Hill right now by these big defense contractors that spend a lot of money on members of Congress and who have incredible influence, and the Pentagon, which has incredible influence. I think there's probably some pushback underway right now that we can't quite see.
I know that there was one of the some people in Congress. The one guy's going on about, there's nothing to this. If there was, I'd know all about it. Blah 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 blah. Yeah. And then my researcher did a little work on him, and most of his money comes from Raytheon. Hello. So he's gonna he's gonna do what they tell him to do.
He's the guy whose district includes Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, right?
Yes, yeah, and see I don't know. The thing is that these, what we're hearing now is one of the guys in the congressional interview said something to the effect is like, as soon as we find out where these facilities are, the moving vans are going to start rolling. And I think that there's probably some truth to that, because these guys aren't going to want to get caught with this. They're not going to want to get caught with this stuff, because it's going to be pretty hot.
What's your take on Arrow, the new UFO office? And I ask in this context is Dave Grush has provided a lot of detailed information. He sent it up through the chain. It's available at the DOD and at and the Inspector General, and also to members of Congress about these programs, these secret programs that supposedly had siphoned away tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of legitimate national security dollars over the years. And it seems like that has gone nowhere with Arrow, this organization. The director of that came out and said, I've seen no credible evidence of any kind of strange technology, exotic stuff that's beyond the laws of physics. It seemed like he was pouring cold water over all those whistleblowers who might be standing in the wings ready to testify.
Well, right. Somebody in that capacity would say something like that. You'd have to think he was an idiot, because there's just so much evidence and information out there that, the only way somebody would say that is if they're just trying to, like you said, cover it up or put cold water over it.
Let's talk about you a little bit.
Really,
so
that capacity has to know what's going on.
Right. As I mentioned in the introduction to you, you were a STAR team leader, investigator, that working directly with OSAP, the DIA's UFO investigation. You couldn't talk about it back then. Can you describe that setup for our audience members unfamiliar with it, how the arrangement worked of BASS and MUFON? Sorry about all these acronyms, but BASS was a subsidiary of Bigelow Aerospace, which got a contract for this program, this UFO investigation, from the DIA. And it contracted with MUFON and your team. Tell us about how that was set up.
Okay, BASS was a subsidiary of Bigelow. BASS is, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, and it was like a sister company to Bigelow Aerospace. And that was sort of like a research arm for that whole corporate facility. So what you had is MUFON was the largest UFO organization in the world, and since 1970, they have a database that's a collection of the reports that are submitted to MUFON. So if someone sees a UFO or has an encounter or whatever, they go online and they can submit a report, a UFO report, and those reports are all kept in a system at MUFON. They call it CMS, but it's basically a very, very well-maintained system where people go in and make reports. I mean, you
but it's hundreds of them a month, right?
Well, back then we were getting about 850 reports a month, and so just the average person would go in there and you'd fill out a pretty detailed form. It asks a lot of questions, about the incident and the object and all that kind of thing, and the person fills the report out. And then MUFON has what they call field investigators, or people that look into those reports. So what the value with MUFON is they have this really extensive database of like thousands and thousands of UFO reports. So what happened was basically Bass got involved with MUFON and basically made a deal to buy information from MUFON. And so that's what my role was, is we had set up it was originally called the STAR team. I was one of the original people that started it back in the day. And the STAR team was originally about a half a dozen people that were really experienced investigators and work on really the really most complex cases. And I ran that. Well, when we made the deal with Bass, basically what we did is we had a team of people. First of all, everybody was paid. I got a salary, and all the people that work for me were paid. And basically what we did is we had a team of about 12 people. We called them dispatchers. And what they would do is they'd go through that database there was somebody on duty all the time, and they'd look at all the reports coming in. And so they'd look at the report and try to validate the information, and because there's some people that just put goofy stuff in there, and you have to weed through all that. So the bottom line is out of 850 reports, we maybe get they cull it down to maybe 50 really good reports that we were really interested in. And then once we get to that point, then I would deploy investigators to go out and look into those cases and interview the individuals and collect the data. And then ultimately I would put all that information together and submit a report to Bass on that particular case. So they were getting probably 35, 50 reports a month from us that were all verified and investigated. And then at that point, I'll tell you what,
let me interrupt you, Richard. We'll continue that part of the conversation because I really want our audience to hear how the process worked. We're talking with Richard Lang, First Responders Guide to UFO Encounters. We're talking with Richard Lang about UFO investigation, First Responders Guide to UFO Encounters, his new book, which would presumably prepare first responders, police, fire, ambulance for strange encounters, crash saucers, alien beings, things of that sort. Do our first responders need this kind of training? We're going to get into that right after this on Coast to Coast. Richard, before the break, you were explaining to us sort of the process for this STAR team program that had a contract with Bigelow Aerospace, which was the contractor for the DIA. So MUFON would get 800 or so reports a month, and then you whittle them down to 50 or so of the best that goes to the STAR team. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. And again, those people were watching that database on a 24/7. And so when a case would come in, they'd verify it as best they could. Like an example of that would be one night a report came in, and it was and the person said they were a Catholic priest. And so when we did the background check on it, the phone number came up in the middle of a big Catholic church complex. So we're like, okay, that probably validates that he is who he says he is, that kind of thing. And so they go through that, validate all the information they could, and then we'd end up with about 50 really good cases that we'd work with. And we'd send investigators to interview them, and then ultimately a final report would go to Bass. And then once it got on their side of the mirror, then they would look at it and maybe go back out and interview the person again or do medical tests or whatever they wanted to do.
How many of those cases do you think you personally investigated, that you went out into the field and dug into? We had basically what we did, we had 50 people that we designated as investigators, people that we trusted and wanted to work with, and I would send them out. Sometimes there was a couple, like for example, there was a case up in New York where it affected a car,
And investigator went and looked at the case, and then I went back. Once I got everything together, I went back out and interviewed the guy second time myself. I'd say probably about 20 of those cases I personally was involved in some respect, where I actually talked to the people. And the whole idea with it was we had the money. We were getting $57,000 a month from that contract. And so, an example would be at the time I was living in North Carolina. A case came in. It was in Texas. And the case, they contacted me at 10 o'clock in the morning about the case. And at 6 o'clock that evening, I was in the guy's backyard.
Oh, man.
So we could move fast.
It makes all the difference in the world to have resources, to have the money to finance the trips, and to have the people screening the calls, right?
Yes. Yeah, the people screened the calls, and then we had all the resources. That we had a operations person that would basically make airline reservations, hotel reservations, that kind of thing, ship equipment to them. And it was very well oiled, and we could move really fast, which is what you have to do if you want to get on something quick. You want to get there before it gets out in the media and all that kind of thing.
Some of these cases are pretty sensitive, but of the ones that you can talk about, hit me with one that our audience would be bowled over by hearing about.
Well, there was I know in the book that you guys wrote, the Skinwalker at the Pentagon, you referenced one of the cases you referenced in there. I actually worked on, and an individual was basically he's at home and he hears the dogs barking, and he goes outside, and there's a huge triangle shaped craft hovering over his backyard. And there was a lot to it, but what he did was he took one of those real bright spotlights and put it up on, tried to light the craft up. And when he did that, a real hot white beam came down and burned him. When I went to see him, he had it looked like real bad sunburn, and really interesting case. And what I'd say there was some pretty good physical evidence there because of the physiological, the burns on his skin and that kind of thing. In New York, one of the best cases I've ever worked on was an individual. He was a psychiatric doctor that worked in a facility, and he worked night turn. So it's midnight and he's on his way home, and he's driving. It's up in Port Jarvis, New York, and it's like kind of winding country road. And as he comes over one of the hills, he sees a light that's kind of at high altitude and pretty far away. And, as he's driving along, it seems like the light's getting closer and closer. And he's really curious. So he pulls off the side of the road to watch this thing to see what it is. And pretty soon, it comes right over his car, like maybe 150 feet above his car. And it's rotating. And when that happens, everything in the car goes out. The headlights go out, dash lights go out, the radio goes off, his cell phone goes dead. And he's basically sitting there in the dark, and this thing's hovering over the car. And he said it sounded like a cat purring, which is pretty common in some of those encounter cases. But what he did was he said at first he was curious, and he started getting really scared. And I remember him telling me, he says, I wasn't sure to get out of the car, should I run or what, And by the way, the answer is always stay in the car. But he opened the door, and when he looked up at it, it disappeared. And, I said to him, well, did it fly away or did the lights go out? He goes, I don't know. I just stepped on what happened was when it disappeared, the car came back on. And he said, I just stepped on the gas, and I went through every stop sign and red light on the way home. The big significant thing about that case was when we went to investigate it, it had a huge, very strong magnetic field around it. Investigator told me he walked up to it, he put his hand out, and like 10 inches away from the car, you could feel the static cling like you get when you take a sweater out of a cleaner bag or something like that. And we did tests on it, and it had a very strong magnetic field around the car. And the thing that I think was most interesting about the case was the guy told us that, I said, well, when it left, what happened? He said, everything came back on. And I said, so you mean the engine started? He said, no, the engine didn't start. It was just running again. And I'm like, help me understand that. What do you mean? And he said it was like if you were watching a movie and you pushed the pause button and then you pushed the play button again. And I said, you mean the motor didn't, crank and then start? And he said, no, it's just running again, which is really, really interesting.
So these things are real. There are physical consequences. They're not imaginary. People didn't dream them up. It's not an illusion. It's not a dream. These things were real, and in cases that you investigated, there are physical consequences both on people and on machinery and the environment.
Absolutely, yes. And people will get their physiological symptoms. People have various health problems, sickness. One of the most common ones is people say that I had a taste. It tasted like my mouth was full of pennies. It had a real strong copper taste to it. Things like that. Burn marks, and various. They're disoriented and nauseous and that kind of thing.
So that is part of why you realize that it's a physical reality, that it has consequences, which is part of the reason you wrote this book for first responders, right? Because the time may come in the careers of first responders, police, fire, when they come upon a scene where some level of expertise would be needed.
Well, I think part of the purpose in writing the book was because the people that in law enforcement are not trained about this. I've worked in law enforcement both on the state and the federal level, and I went through the police academy and all the government training and involved with when I was with Homeland Security. I was on the anti-terrorist task force. There isn't one word of any training ever about in any of that. Police officers are just simply not trained about it, as if it doesn't exist. And what really prompted me to write the book was I was talking to the sheriff here where I live, who I know, and he was, he's asking me what I'm doing. I told him I was writing books about it. He's like really interested in it, and and he said, "Would you come and talk to my guys?" And I just like to get them up to speed on this, because now that it's in the public domain and it's real, and people realize it's real. A lot of these sheriffs and police agencies, their people need to be trained, and no one ever has been trained before. So when I wrote the book, there's a little bit about the history in the book and how it's all developed, and also there's a more realistic scenario, like if there is a crash or something something comes down like that. The reconnaissance people are going to be on it immediately, and so the local police would be used to maintain a perimeter around something like that. So if there's a crash, the recon unit's going to get there, and then they're going to want a perimeter set up. They're going to put a story out, that there's been some kind of a toxic spill or something with the media to keep people away from there. And then the local police would be typically involved in in maintaining a perimeter. And a lot of times I would think that I'm pretty sure that the local police really might not know what's going on inside that perimeter, because you're going to have a specialized team of recovery people that are going to go in there and analyze the wreckage and do certain tests looking for radiological information and, electromagnetic fields. And so they're going to do a lot of tests on that and then secure it. And then ultimately it's got to be packed up and transported out of there. And so at least if the people that read my book would at least understand what's going on with it.
So you're not describing
also I put a chapter in there about what to do and not do if you ever encounter this kind of stuff, because as we know, there's certain hazards that would affect a human in close proximity to one of those things. So the things like, if there's a craft that's hovering, you don't want to walk underneath it, because the electrogravitic fields that come out from out of it will burn you like it'd be like sticking your arm in a microwave oven, and it'll clearly do tissue damage. If you have if you have a craft that's on the ground and it's still powered up, there might be like an ultraviolet radiation that comes off the skin of the craft or the metallic surface, and it would burn you like a sunburn. And there's also some cases where you've got radiation in like the X-ray spectrum that's strong enough to give you radiation sickness. So, an officer needs to understand that if you get around something like that, you have to be careful and keep a distance from it to protect yourself. And not only that, like I said that in my book, I said if you're in a squad car, the best thing to do is stay in the car because the metal in the car protects you from a lot of that. And then, also things like if you get in close proximity where there's entities involved, if you have a gun in your duty belt in your holster, you need to leave it there. Displaying a weapon would probably result in, disasters if you did that. Because remember, you're dealing with entities that have technology that's 1,000 years ahead of ours. And so anything hostile towards them would probably be a big mistake.
Let's say cops arrive at a scene. There's a flying saucer sitting in a field. It would be overwhelmingly tempting to go out and touch it, but that's not a good idea either, is it?
No. I think you'd want to keep your distance from it, and also because just what I said, if you get close, you could get burned or radiation sickness from it. The propulsion that's used in these things, they call it's electrogravitic, and it's very similar to microwave in terms of how it'll affect skin tissue, and particularly underneath one, you just have to be really careful not to do that, and also one of the things, I know this sounds a little quirky, but in my book, I said that if you do come across a situation like where there's a crash or wreckage and there may be entities that are still alive in there, you have to be careful about your mindset. If you approach something like that, you want to have in your mind thoughts of compassion and thinking I'm here to help and stuff like that, rather than, thinking that you're going to go to guns on somebody if, I'm going to shoot the place up. And that I think is really important too. And it's kind of a hard concept for some people maybe to accept, but clearly entities like that can telepathically sense what your intentions are. And I think you want to project, an air of compassion and, I'm here to help kind of thing.
People who are not well versed in the subject think it's all imaginary and are unaware of that there are some serious injuries that have been reported by people who come into proximity with these things. I'm thinking of Bentwaters, the American serviceman, John Burroughs, for example. He got dosed and eventually was received medical benefits from the government because of his on-duty injuries, right?
Yes, exactly. And that does happen. And in my first book, which was a book designed to teach people how to investigate, there were a lot of those kind of physiological symptoms that were listed in there. But it does. A lot of it has to do. The most common injury from a UFO encounter is an injury to the eyes.
So just from
that's the most common. The most common type of injury is eye injuries, where like you get light hurts your eyes and that kind of thing.
What else? What other kinds?
I think the psychic effects are there's a big part of that where people are really traumatized and and depending on how the encounter unfolds, particularly having interviewed many abductees, a lot of times. That when they walk away from something like that, they do something to them so they can't remember it. So they'll be very agitated and concerned and upset, but they can't remember exactly what happened to them. So I'd say probably eye injuries and then also psychic effects where someone is really traumatized or very, on a subconscious level, they've been really, really, horribly upset.
The OSAP program, one of their focuses, as you know, was on injuries, on the human effects. And it seems like many of the things that happen, if not most of the things, the injuries that happen in proximity of UFOs were only because people are in the general area, not intentional. But there are some exceptions to that over the years. Did you investigate anything like that?
Well, I think that, working with the BASS team, we one of the things that I think that they would convey to me is that, yes, there have been people that were injured, but it wasn't by deliberate intention. It's like, somebody walked under a hovering craft and got burned, or, but it wasn't because they deliberately injured them. But there are, the case that you all had in your book where the beam of light burned a guy, it was obviously, when you put he had put a real bright, high-powered, camo-powered spotlight up on it. And when he did that, then there's basically return fire. This beam of light came down. Generally, that's another thing I put in my book for the police is don't point any kind of high-intensity flashlights or spotlights at them, because every time, all the casework that I've done, every time somebody does that, it ends badly.
We're going to get into a lot more examples in the next hour. We're talking with Richard Lang about First Responders Guide to UFO Encounters, his latest book.